If you do have questions, please feel free to tap them into the chat box there. I'm sure whatever questions you have, others might also have. So the idea for today is to provide a strategic briefing on what it means once Mythos gets out of the preview and it gets into the hands of adversaries. And it doesn't necessarily need to be Mythos. It could be another comparable LLM, which most folks seem to believe will be in the hands of everyone within the next 6 months. We are focusing this discussion on managed service providers, managed security service providers, but it also certainly applies to internal IT teams as well. But if you do notice, some of the language will be around SMBs and managed service providers that provide security for them. So my name is Anoop Ghosh. Welcome to this podcast, webinar, webcast, whatever we want to call it. I am co-founder and CEO of ThreatMate. What is ThreatMate? ThreatMate is an AI-powered VulnOps platform, purpose-built for MSPs. Our goal is to find and fix security exposures before the bad guys find and exploit them. Now, obviously, for economic gain and obviously for brand damage that accrues to the victims. So now, in the light of AI, offensive technologies, this timeline really matters, which is why we're really focused on it. We'll spend a lot of time talking about timelines today and how they're radically changing. So enough about me. Let's get on to the topic matter. I will leave a little bit of time at the end to kind of go through those questions. So pardon me if I'm not stopping to check the chat while we go along here. Also, a couple of things I'm going to leave with you. At the end of this deck is 4 tearaway slides that you can use with your clients. The whole idea is to equip you with the conversation starter, either with your boards or with your clients, to talk about what does this mean for us, right? What does this changing cybersecurity landscape mean in terms of how we need to prepare? You don't need to have all the answers. No one has all the answers, but you do need to start the conversation. And this sets the table for you to be that trusted advisor on these issues. If you're not having these conversations, believe me, they're having them and they'll have them with someone else. So hopefully this provides a good starter for you to have those conversations. I will provide the deck. I'll also provide a copy of the recording for everyone who registered. I know that people can't necessarily make this time slot, so we'll make this recording available to everyone who registered. And then the second free gift, if you will, is I will give you access to our preview of agentic pen testing that we're releasing next week called Kraken. And you'll be able to run a free agentic pen test and see that live in action as well. So let's talk some about what this means for Mythos. And by the way, I will keep to half an hour because I know everyone's super busy and needs to go on to other things. So the big deal about Mythos is it basically breaks the math that we've always relied on. And the inherent assumption for the last 20, going on 30 years is finding vulnerabilities hard, writing exploits for vulnerabilities is even harder, and chaining vulnerability exploits into attacks is even harder, right? And we'll get into some of those timelines. And that timeline, that difficulty that drove the timeline also, in fact, drove everything else, like SLAs on criticals, highs, moderates. It drove even the rating system of vulnerability. So, a CVSS of 5, we might need to rethink the rating system because of chaining, that now becomes possible. With Mythos, it not only means that you can find more vulnerabilities, but you can find 10x more vulnerabilities. It's almost like on-demand vulnerability finder. So Cloud Opus 4.6 is not necessarily the latest and greatest model, but it's a very good model. And today, it was applied and it generated 2 working Firefox exploits, which, nation states would pay for, right? If they're truly 0 days. Now with Mythos, they're able to find 181 working exploits of Firefox, right? So that's what we're talking about. We'll talk some about what this means for the software supply chain. The other real critical takeaway is you don't need to be one of these lead coders, lead hackers to find this. And that was always, the barrier. So we would talk about script kiddies that would take the tools that were built by the lead hackers, right? Whether it was Metasploit, and then some of the commercial variants like Cobalt. But basically, now the script kiddies, anyone can use these same tools to generate arbitrary vulnerabilities and, more importantly, exploitabilities. So let's talk some about timelines, right? So this timeline dates back to 2018, which is long enough ago. And the window between when a vulnerability is published and then when it's weaponized was about 2.3 years or 2.5 years. That was pretty comfortable. And that's because there's a lot of, again, human review and coding. And back in those days, how do you smash the stack to get your code into the right register to then be executed? All that was difficult, right? Fast forward 2023, that timeline shrunk to 5 months. And we began to feel some pressure if you're on an IT ops team. Now in 2026, pre-Mythos, 20 hours, right? So the technology had already advanced so much that window between when a vulnerability was disclosed and when it was weaponized shrank to 20 hours. And now we're talking minutes, right? So this notion of how we patch has got to change fundamentally. And of course, that also drives us towards VulnOps being radically changed as well. So one thing that, I need to talk about to my audience is, this belief that these problems don't apply to the SMB. It actually does apply to the SMB and more than ever. So if you weren't worried about 0 days before because you thought that was the domain of the big banks and government agencies, the reality is, no, this is now your problem. The marginal cost of executing an attack starts to approach zero with AI. And as we'll look at the software stack, this definitely applies to the SMB space. So the SMB, of course, doesn't have the resources of a high-end SOC team dedicated to them. So you are the low-hanging fruit. And if you look here at the global software supply chain and how this becomes almost a trickle-down threat, you can see, this applies to you. So a good example here from many years ago was the Log4j vulnerability, which was a core library used in a lot of software components, which then gets embedded in your commercial software, which if you're a managed service provider, you're managing those desktops and servers, provisioning software, managing it, which means it's running on your client's networks and endpoints. And, a flaw found in one of these fundamental libraries is going to, in fact, impact your clients. So what does this really mean? Well, pre-AI, when we looked at how things work from a timeline perspective, you did have lead teams. The best, of course, worked on government contracts, finding 0 days, but that took weeks and months. In terms of how you defended against it, it really was these patch management cycles, prioritized KVs, which came out of CISA, and then criticals with SLAs, typically in the weeks time frame. And then, of course, the mandate is, hey, Patch Tuesday's coming up. Let's give it a week and, make sure we get these covered with our RMM. Now in the post-Mythos era, we really have to think about the fact that the bad guys are doing continuous zero-day discovery on timelines in minutes and hours. And the traditional approach of how we manage our defenses has to change to continuous AI-driven vulnops, as well as other technologies that we've kind of let go by the wayside. And kind of put this graphically, if you look at the attacker speed, that top line there, and how rapidly that's increasing from disclosure to weaponization, if we stay on the same curve as we have, and we continue to do business as usual, what actually happens is a widening gap. I'll actually call it an exposure gap between an attacker can see and exploit from the moment that a vulnerability is disclosed and weaponized. So we have to keep pace with autonomous AI defense. So let's talk some about what this means for you in terms of architecting for the AI era. Many of you, I'm sure, were at RSA. If you weren't, I'll give you my recap, which is everyone talked about agents, obviously, and AI, obviously, right? But the prevailing wisdom coming out of the conference was back to basics. I think that was an undercurrent that was missed by a lot of people. We'll understand now this isn't about zero-day technologies and niche technologies anymore. It really is about back to basics. How do you architect for an era when someone will be able to breach your defenses, right? And so these ideas around containment, micro-segmentation are going to get a breath of fresh air, I believe, now. The need for defensive agents, which is essentially using the same technologies, AI, that the bad guys are using, but for defense, is the right approach, because you have to operate at machine speed. You can't wait for a SOC team to look for, the signals that there's compromise and then scramble while compromise are going on all over the place. So you need autonomous agents to not only detect, but also, more importantly, to harden, right? Find and fix. I like to call it find and fix while you sleep. That's what you want your agents doing, which also means that we'll need some updated risk tolerance for these architectures, and clearly governance. I know everyone's focused on governance of agents, right? So having governance allows you to do things like embrace defensive agents. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who love to comment on that. Feel free to comment on that as well. Actually, be great to publish some of these comments. So my conclusion to all of this is wake up, right? Wake up, people. The era of reactive security is over. Had a good run. There's lots of people who still are focused on right of boom. Congrats. There's going to be a lot of right of boom stuff now. However, you need to be able to stop these attacks. You need to start architecting for preventing these attacks from succeeding in their goals. And that's where AI-driven autonomous hardening is essential, which I'll talk about next. So next, we're going to pivot some towards how we can actually address this. I'll talk some about the evolution of pen testing from automated, and obviously prior to automated pen testing, we had human red teams, which we still have, but the human red teams were using automation anyway, towards autonomy. And the way I like to think about automated pen test is like the script kiddie approach towards hacking. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, where you did have elite red teams that use novel techniques in order to break into networks and compromise, which it would include social engineering, physical access, but also lots of great tooling. Whereas automated pen testing really is about, running scripts that are followed well-defined playbooks in what I call amnesic execution, right? So you're basically running the same script on every device without regard to context and without really understanding the environment in which they're running. And what you end up with is something that looks a lot like vulnerability scanning, but maybe a little bit better, right? So that's automated pen testing. Um, way I would describe agentic pen testing is it operates like an elite human team, but I would say arguably better, unless your elite human team is also, entering premises and doing all kinds of cool stuff like that. But with agentic pen testing, you do get adaptive reasoning. We're going to talk about this, so don't worry, it's not just slideware. We're going to talk about what this means to be adaptive in how you address the situation you find yourself in if you're software. You also really importantly get to chain exploitation, right? And again, this goes back to what we're talking about with Mythos. Chaining exploitation is a big deal. And then finally, and I think maybe most importantly, you get persistent learning. Sounds a lot like a red team, right? So you learn from every pen test, and those learnings carry forward. So if you're to compare automated pen testing against agentic intelligence, again, automation, you have a sort of fixed playbook checklist of tests you'll run. You find an issue, you log it, you move on. And every time you run a pen test, it's like starting from scratch, from a blank sheet. In the output, you might find some cool stuff, but you're also going to find a lot of noisy stuff that you've got to wade through and figure out what's real, what's not. You're probably not going to get that attack chain. You'll see, on a good day, you'll see an exploitable vulnerability that could potentially lead to admin, which is the finding, right? Compare that to agentic. So here we're talking about the Kraken agentic pen testing, where you will see adaptive reasoning via an OODA loop, the ability to pivot based on what you find, choose the right tool to exploit and follow a chain towards an end goal. Having persistent learnings that compounds every time is a massive driver of intelligence in the tooling. And then on an output, you get confirmed attack paths and demonstrated impact. So that's a really big deal. In terms of how we do agentic pen testing, we start with recon, just like most scanners would do, understanding the environment, mapping ports, understanding what the infrastructure looks like underneath. And for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about cloud-based web applications, just to set the context there a little bit better. But notice our next step here is we inject the prior learnings into our agent so that it starts from not a blank slate, but from kind of a curated history of learnings before going against the target. And once we start testing the target, we're going to go through an iteration based on what we find. We'll send out a probe, we'll understand what's going on. Based on what comes back from that probe, we'll reason, adapt, choose the next right tool for that situation, for what we found. Try another tool, pivot, and keep going, chaining exploits till we get to our objective or we run out of steps, right? We cap the number of iterations. It's selectable, anywhere from 20 to 50. Obviously, more iterations is more cost, token cost. And then at the end, we write our learnings. And again, this is probably the most important part of this whole thing, is learning from that pen test. So what dead ends did we hit? That becomes a learning. And that gets saved in the vault. Because when we see that situation again, we'll know not to go down that path of the tree, and what actually worked, right? So those vault updates go right back into the injected context when we start the next pen test, and then write out a full report. So this is an example of a real pen test we ran against Azure Goat, which was a web application that runs on Azure. Found a server-side request forgery vulnerability, escalate privileges, found an SSH key and blob storage, obviously not secure, gained VM access, was able to execute with the key a login, and then assume full tenant compromise from an SSRF vulnerability, right? In 28 iterations. And I just watched it go. It just did it. These are some of the tooling. If you're familiar with web application vulnerabilities, you'll be familiar with these terms. We've got over 20 of these, I think 28 or so of these different tools in the arsenal right now that it can choose. It doesn't have to use them. There's no playbook. It chooses the right tool based on the situation that it finds. And we did some measurement on the compound learning, and it was absolutely stunning how from run one, where it started from a blank slate, to run two, where it started with injected context from the prior run, it doubled its performance in how fast it actually compounded, or I'm sorry, how fast it actually compromised in the first and second run. And eventually, of course, that rate slows down as it approaches some asymptote, but the compounding effect is real. And we talk about levels of compromise if you see a report. Even partial access is like gaining user account and credentials to a demonstrated impact to full compromise of the cloud infrastructure. It is able to get that pretty often. So our conclusion is we are near the end of the script kiddie era of pen testing. The same technologies that are behind Mythos will drive defensive AI, right? And I think it's now time to start preparing for this, right? You want to be using agentic pen testing so that you know what the bad guys will also be doing to your network or your client networks. So the whole idea here is get ahead of the adversary, understand what the bad guys can see, look at those attack chains that it finds, and then remediate, auto-harden behind, right? So that's the whole idea on how you use AI defensively to do autonomous hardening in front of the adversary. So as I promised, I would leave you with this special preview of the Kraken pen tester. We're going to release this publicly on Monday. So you'll see a press release go out, or maybe you won't see it. It'll go out. But I have run it, and it's compromised every website I own and tested against. And we tested it against a bunch of, obviously, pre-seeded websites for this. And there's some of them on there if you check it out. If you do want to run it against a test site, we provide some. Don't run it on a site you don't own that's not one of these test sites, okay? That's called hacking, and there's US criminal code on that situation. So don't do that. If you own the website, web application, and are authorized, go ahead and run it. And I think you'll be startled at how good it is. These are the 4 slides I also promised you that I would leave you with that you can use. If you're internal IT, you should, have this discussion with the powers that be so that you begin to start that conversation. By the way, they're asking these questions. They are. So you want to be prepared to have those questions. And if it's your client and you're having a strategic business review or quarterly business review, whatever you prefer to call it, use these slides, take them, leave them, whatever. If we're helpful, that's great. These are, again, just summarizing what we already talked about. This recommendation does come from some heavyweights in the industry that put this together. So it's not a noob's point of view. It's actually some of the heavyweights in the cybersecurity industry that came up with these recommendations and want you to start preparing for the post-Mythos era. And this is a good one. You want your client invested in the outcome, which means you need a call to action from them, right? So come together with a call to action, get their buy-in, and get going. Obviously, would love for you to try ThreatMate, but build your own. Why not? With that, I will conclude the presentation and see if there's any questions that I can find in the interim. I can find, go. All right. Okay, there's a couple question. Patrick from ThreatMate says, hey, question for everyone, what's your current patch SLA for criticals? That's a great question. Go ahead and type it in. And that's a great answer from Matt. Yep. Is Kraken designed for internal and external testing or optimized for external web and cloud app testing? Great question. Kraken is designed for external web application and cloud testing. Okay. You will see agentic pen testing for internal coming out. Not Monday, but you will see it coming out. At a time to be disclosed. But yeah, same technology, different targets. Andre, who always attends, thank you, Andre, for attending again. Can we run the pen test if we get permission from the website owner? Yes, you can. That's what it's designed. You might want to get that in writing. That I suggest. Don't run a pen test without permission, and have it in writing. Chris, are you able to opt out of your site scans data being used to train the model? No. I understand the question. We don't have an opt-out. I'm not sure we will, but the learning is a key part of all of this. Every time you run a pen test, it ends up training the model better. So I understand the concern and the question. I will send the slide deck for you, for sure, to everyone. And that's what we got right now. So with that, we are at the top of the hour, and I thank you very much for attending. And if you're not watching this live, thank you for viewing.